Okay, so we're going to look at specifically 5.4 here, um, parts that we did not really touch in the previous video. So 5.4 here is essentially looking at why do people preserve local languages. We're going to talk about extinct languages and kind of isolated languages and some challenges that arise from there. So the challenge of lingual diversity, if you will, trying to have multiple languages in one spot is usually difficult, but keep in mind if you think about spatial analysis here, usually when these two languages are at a boundary with each other, that is where you're going to face the greatest challenges. So pretty simple, you have two different languages, at the boundary of them is where you're going to find kind of the biggest challenges between the two languages. An example of this, a developed country of Belgium, okay, you don't think would have as many issues, but however it does. It's a country that faces a lot of domestic, which means in-house, in Belgium, issues because of a mixed lingual character that makes up Belgium. So there's not one language that encompasses the entire country. So they have two essential regions of the country. You have the Flanders in the north, and then you have this French-speaking in the south, the Wallona in the south, and the Flanders in the north. So here's a good example here. This is Belgium here. You have the Flanders in the north and the Wallanoa in the south here. The way they solve this is by kind of blending them both together at times. Brussels, the capital of Belgium, it's officially bilingual, which means they kind of have two official languages in Brussels. Because you have both of these as major languages throughout the country, the capital, if it were just B1, it's kind of plain favorites there. So all the different signs in Brussels are going to have two languages or two different signs to produce both the directions, the information provided on the sign. We'll see this as kind of a centrifugal force, something that is going to kind of split up the country a little bit. If the Flanders really do want their own country, if they want to kind of separate a little bit from Belgium because of their language, one of them, they would instantly become one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. On the other end, the Wallona, you're going to have one of the most poorest. So instantly you're going to have a really wealthy state and you're going to have a really poor state simply on the division of language. This division of language is also part of the reason why you're going to continue to have these conflicts between the two, in addition to one is really wealthy and one is really poor, thus kind of making Belgium, in another example, not going to be an example of a nation state. As you can see, it's pretty multi-ethnic with the different languages being used in Belgium. Switzerland, on the other hand, is entirely different. They are a multilingual state, very diverse when it comes to these languages. A little bit about Switzerland is that they are usually neutral. They don't join a lot of alliances. They try to stay out of all these different wars, which makes them also very tolerant of differences that may come into their country. So actually, just because you have many different languages does not mean your state can't work. Even though this is kind of a centrifugal force, it does. Switzerland does succeed as a pretty stable country, even with the language division. The Swiss overall are very notorious, again, like I said, because they're very tolerant. You have four kind of official languages in the country: German, French, Italian, and Romish. So these are all different official languages. Everything's printed in these throughout, but it's also a little more isolated, because it being a much more isolated country, as you guys can see here, very mountainous. It's going to make it a little more isolated. Now the isolation is what helps them to kind of succeed a little bit. So usually decisions in Switzerland are done at the local level. So also, again, kind of an example of a federal system letting those localities kind of govern themselves. Thus, or this example is for languages. So here now we have an example of Nigeria, developing country. They have a difficult time balancing between the different kind of languages. So with the many issues of developing countries, having many languages is definitely not going to help. It's actually going to help kind of separate the country, cause a lot of issues. Nigeria is the most populous of the African countries. You have over 200 million people living there, but you have over 500 different spoken languages in Nigeria alone. Okay, the three largest, only an eighth of the speakers. So if you add up the three largest, that's still only going to solve kind of an issue between 1 out of every 8 speakers in Nigeria. This is a good example of all the kind of different ethnic groups with the different languages. As you can see, there's no real regional divide. It's hard to separate it. Again, language is going to be a centrifugal force here because there's so many different languages, which makes Nigeria very, very difficult to govern, along with religion and different cultural divides throughout. Because Nigeria is so diverse, its capital, Abuja, was moved to a more, quote, neutral location in the middle of the country in 1991. The old capital, Lagos, was located in the deep Yoruba-dominated southwest, continuously causing conflict. So this is not just a language issue. You can definitely see it's kind of a ethnicity issue here, but keep in mind ethnicity and language are going to be combined to be an example here for our culture unit. So something we didn't really go over in class too much, but it's a good geographic example of a forward capital. So anytime a country moves its capital into establishing more fuller control, think about the the size and the different shapes of those states we kind of have looked at before. If you put it more in the center, it's called the forward capital because you want to have a capital that kind of brings the entire country together. Another example of this is Myanmar, which recently moved its major capital to be a more central location. Same thing for Brasilia. When we looked at different migration patterns, we saw that they moved it into the center because they wanted to start having the population go towards more of the center of Brazil instead of just the coastal region. So previously we looked at many different languages in a country. Does that work? Does it sometimes not work? Now for these isolated languages, again, isolated language is one that is unrelated to any other language or family. It's not that it's just further away, nobody can talk to those people, so they're isolated. No, an isolated language sometimes is isolated on an island, but it's unrelated to any other language or family. It's on its own. It's entirely different than any other language in the world. So one good example of this is Basque, which is in Europe. It's going to be on the border between Spain and France. We talked about the Basque in class a little bit, looking at nation states, whether this nation can have its own state or not. We'll get to that here kind of in a second. But it's the only European language currently spoken that predates the arrival of the Indo-European speakers. So when we look at the Anatolians or the Kyrgyz coming, so before they arrived, this is the only language that is still around since those people kind of came into that area. Just shows kind of how old that language is. It's spoken by 500,000 people in the Pyrenees Mountain region of both Spain and France. So it's not in just one country. They kind of cross over boundaries to not many countries, just two countries, but you can kind of see here northern Spain, southern France, in this area. This is, quote, the Basque country, a land of area that the Basque kind of represent. Again, this is kind of a tangent here, but it gives a good overall look. The Basque also believe their lingual differences from Spain, from France, means they should have their own country. So their reason for their own country is very similar to Quebec, is because of language that is entirely different than the surrounding areas. Okay, another isolated language. This is on an island. They are actually isolated, and the reason the language, and that helps to contribute to why the language is isolated, is Icelandic. This has changed less than any other Germanic language. And again, as soon as these people got here, they were very isolated. All right, it's not changing as much. They don't have no communication with everybody else, so therefore the language is not going to change. Whereas when you had kind of English here, you have all these different people moving in, moving out. Okay, that is going to change the language quite a bit. So now moving on to extinct languages. Okay, so the overall definition here of the extinct languages is one that is no longer spoken or read in daily activities by anybody in the world. We still might know the language, there still might be a record of it, it's just extinct that nobody uses it day to day. So if you know an extinct language, it doesn't mean it's not extinct anymore, it just simply means it's not being used on a day-to-day basis. Currently we have roughly almost 500 languages that are nearly extinct. A lot in the Americas, that's going to be a little more natives. Native American population is going to kind of contribute to that. This is a little more islands, hopefully you can kind of see here. And amazingly, in Africa, you don't have as many as you would think, but that's because those people are continuously using their same language that they've always had. Currently, we have about 70 now extinct languages in the United States were once spoken by the Native Americans. So if you need a good general example of extinct languages, Native Americans definitely account for a lot here in the Americas. This gentleman here, Edwin Benson, is the last living speaker of Mandan, which was a native language for the American Sioux, which was out west United States, the Dakota area. When he dies, this language will become extinct because nobody else is using it in their day-to-day lives. So just because we might know it, we might have his words recorded, nobody else is using it in their day-to-day lives. Linguists, on the other hand, expect hundreds of languages will become extinct during the 21st century. What I would like you to think about is actually what would contribute to this. What is going to contribute to having all these extinct languages? Hopefully your answer revolves a little bit around globalization, English becoming a very dominant language, other languages taking over other small languages to kind of bring the world together. So the fewer languages you have, the easier it is to communicate with the world. But the downside of that is you lose a huge part of your culture. So right now only about 300 languages are widely spoken and are kind of safe from extinction. So remember, we had thousands of languages when we started this, but only 300 are very safe kind of from extinction. On the other end, now we have revived languages. These languages were once extinct, okay, but now people are trying to use them in their day-to-day activity. Okay, so again, revived languages are extinct languages that essentially were revived. As long as you have extensive documentation of that language, you can revive it. So we have some languages that have been extinct, we'll never learn them again, but other languages, if you have any kind of documentation of the language, it can later be revived. An example of this is the Hebrew language. So associate this with Judaism, Jewish people. It was extinct for about 2,000 years, and it was revived in the late 19th century. This is going to be the late 1800s. And the reason for this is, one of the reasons it was revived was because it was preserved for years in the Torah. That's going to be the holy book of the Jewish people. So because it was preserved, okay, eventually somebody was able to kind of revive this, if you will. So Ben Yehuda here worked basically to revive the Hebrew language. He published dictionaries kind of incorporating new words, and pushed for kind of fellow Jews to adopt the language again. So most Jewish people were using languages in the region of the world that they were living in. So one way he actually started this was actually kind of interesting. He used his son, Itamar here. His son was actually raised being a native speaker of Hebrew, used it in his everyday life, being the first person to actually speak that language on a daily basis since he was born, since in about 1800 years, since 2000 BCE there. Today, Hebrew again is spoken mainly by Jewish people, mainly people that live in Israel. So 6 million people actually speak Hebrew, and then it's also spoken in other places with high Jewish populations. Example here, okay, you can kind of see Hebrew here a little bit, but you also see English. So this is going to be a Jewish neighborhood here in Brooklyn, well, not here in Brooklyn, but in Brooklyn, New York, here in the United States. On the other end here we have Cornish, which is also another example of a revived language. It's a Celtic language. It's kind of semi-revived. It was replaced by English, just like other Celtic languages. Remember, Celtic was spoken in this area before you had all the invaders throughout the years. This kind of shows you kind of the death of it, if you will, of Cornish being a language. So the last actual speaker died in the late 1700s. However, because you had text, okay, had been reintroduced, you had a record of it, the language in some parts of the UK is now being taught again kind of as a second language in a lot of schools in these areas. So it's kind of semi-revived, so it's not going to be as good a language as Hebrew, but it's also a good example of a semi-revived languages. So now, before these languages die out, before they become extinct and you have to revive them again, different places around the world are trying to preserve their local languages. Celtic, okay, is going to be an example of them trying to preserve it. Okay, this is going to be different than Cornish. Okay, they're now trying to preserve what they have left. We also want to kind of know why the Celtic is kind of going away, mainly because of the arrival of English. Has really dispersed kind of the Celtic, more so further away from where the Germanic tribes were. It's still found today in parts of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, peninsula of France. So it's not spoken every day by everybody, but you have pockets of these regions where you can see it. And also notice the further you get away, okay, from the Germanic tribes, you're going to have more and more people speak that language, and it's less frequently used when you get closer to kind of the main part of England. So Celtic speakers continuously work hard to preserve their languages. It's a little more folkish, if you will. They face expansion because of political issues and economic strength of English and French. Many times because a lot of business is done in English, people want to slowly move and transfer to that area. However, if you don't speak English, okay, it's going to be harder and harder to have that day-to-day trading activity. Two quick examples of other language that are threatened by more dominant languages. Obviously, French is kind of in dominating Occitan in southern France there. And then you have Morai in New Zealand, which is also being dominated by English. So two other really short examples of languages that are trying to be preserved. So an interesting thing, you have a new app called Akimua, which basically allows speakers around the world, especially of threatened or near extinct languages, to kind of record their examples of speech. So if you want to know how technology is kind of helping to preserve that, this is a good example for that. So quickly going over lingua franca one more time here. Lingua franca, again, widely used in the international communication, usually to bridge different lingua divides, mainly because of trade and people want to communicate or have business done that way. So we've kindly gone through this before with English being so dominant, but I also want to give you a couple examples of other languages that are considered lingua franca still in the world. Swahili in East Africa, since a lot of them work together and trade together. We talked about this with Swahili. It's going to be a lingua franca for that area. Hindi is going to be a lingua franca for South Asia. So lingua franca doesn't mean everywhere in the world, okay, but English kind of is right now. You can have kind of regionalized lingua francas, basically a common language that many different people are learning the other language to make day-to-day kind of trades. Indonesian in Southeast Asia, and then obviously you can use Russian in the former Soviet Union. It was kind of a lingua franca because all the other different kind of nations that were in the Soviet Union had to speak Russian to carry out day-to-day activities. Thus, that became the common language for all the different Soviet states. For a possible lingua franca in the future, possibly Mandarin. Usually it is because of China and the growing population. Many people, it's going to be the most frequently used online language before 2030. As you can see here, for the most part, it's been growing and growing and growing. English, okay, relatively the same as Chinese or Mandarin, but they believe this will slowly grow on the internet, with Mandarin being the #1 language spoken on the internet. In one of the previous videos, we looked at French in Canada. So now we're going to look at English in America. Kind of keep in mind, 50-some million Americans speak a non-English language as their primary language. That primary language that they do speak, though, usually is Spanish. So about half the people in the United States that don't speak English usually speak Spanish. English is not, again, the official language of the United States. It is legally, quote, the common and uniting language, okay? But we have not decided that is actually the official language. Though many states in the United States are trying to have the official language of their states or have passed laws to have English as their official tongue, but nationally, okay, as a state, a big state itself, we have not passed that law. So many different people, it's very passionate, are about the English language in the United States. They believe that's what, quote, makes us American, would be English. So you see a lot of different protests and kind of politics trying to have that. So you do have resistance to English. Again, some places do resist the influence of English. Again, Quebec being one of them. So you always kind of want to look here about Spanish kind of being equal to English in America, the same as French is to English in Canada.